On a summer night in Newport, beneath glittering chandeliers and gilded ceilings, a fallen woman carries a tray of champagne through the marble halls of power. Once she was a daughter of privilege. Now she serves those who whisper of her disgrace. But when the most powerful heir in the room leans close and whispers, "You will be mine," Eleanor's life collides with destiny. Is it temptation, salvation, or another trap spun by society's cruel design? Behind every glance lies a secret. Behind every gesture, a hidden war between duty and desire. Tell us, where are you listening from tonight? And do you believe love can truly defy the whispers of society? Newport, Rhode Island. Summer of 1892. The sea air drifted in salt-laced gusts through the open windows of the Hayes boarding room, stirring the faded curtains like ghosts of a past long gone. The once grand home on Touro Street now echoed with the silence of decline. Its walls, lined with aging wainscoting and yellowed wallpaper, bore the weight of a name that had once been uttered with reverence in every drawing room from Bellevue Avenue to Boston. Miss Eleanor Hayes stood at the cracked vanity, her fingers trembling as they fastened the last button of her collar. The dress she wore, plain black cotton with sleeves to the wrist and a modest neckline, was not tailored for beauty, only modesty. It had belonged to a housemaid once. Now it belonged to her. Her reflection was that of a woman she hardly recognized, chestnut hair pinned in a low bun with neither ornament nor curl, cheeks paler than the porcelain bowl beside her, and eyes, those once laughing grey-blue eyes, now rimmed with fatigue and uncried tears. From the adjoining room came the gentle rustle of paper and the sigh of a woman too proud to weep aloud. "You mustn't bow your head, Eleanor," said Mrs. Lydia Hayes, emerging with a lace-trimmed handkerchief that had been laundered until nearly threadbare. "Even if you serve their drinks, you are still a Hayes." Eleanor offered her mother a faint smile, one stitched from broken threads of pride and pain. "They've forgotten what that name means. Then let them remember." Lydia's voice faltered only for a moment before recovering its steel. The carriage that arrived for her was not the velvet-lined coach of her youth, but a hired cart used for delivering linens. She stepped into it without complaint, folding her gloved hands tightly in her lap. The journey toward the Vanderbilt mansion passed streets that once opened their arms to her. She did not look out the window. The estate loomed ahead, white marble and manicured hedges aglow in the late afternoon sun. The house pulsed with wealth. Music trickled from the ballroom, the clink of glass and the hum of gossip already alive behind gilded doors. Eleanor descended and joined the line of household staff by the servants' entrance. No one acknowledged her name, only her uniform. Inside, she moved through the corridors of opulence like a shadow of who she had once been. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above her, mocking the dull wool of her uniform. The scent of roses, real ones in towering vases, filled the air, mingling with roasted meats and fine perfumes. "Don't spill anything, Miss Hayes," came the saccharine voice of Beatrice Ashford, her smile sharp as cut glass. Draped in pale blue silk, her blonde curls artfully pinned, she stood with a circle of young men in tailored evening coats and ivory gloves. "Or perhaps you'll want to drink it first. Surely this is finer than the vinegar your mother serves at her table." Laughter rippled through the group. Eleanor bowed her head and moved on, fingers gripping the tray, until her knuckles blanched. Her face burned, but she would not give Beatrice the satisfaction of a single word. She had learned that silence could be armor. She crossed the ballroom with practiced precision, balancing a silver tray lined with crystal flutes. Her steps were steady, even as her heart trembled with each echo of ridicule behind her. Then her foot caught on a slight shift in the carpet. The tray tilted. One glass slipped, fell, and shattered beside a pair of polished black shoes. She began, horrified. But the man did not shout. He did not sneer. He bent instead. Strong hands lifted the tray from her grasp. Her breath caught as she looked up and met the eyes of Marcus Vanderbilt III. He was taller than she remembered from the portraits in society pages. His dark hair, neatly parted, gleamed under the chandelier's light. His face was sharply drawn, aristocratic yet haunted by something unreadable, and his eyes, cool, piercing blue, searched hers with startling intensity. "You're bleeding," he said simply, taking her hand. She hadn't noticed the nick on her finger from the glass. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a white handkerchief, wrapping it around her hand with quiet efficiency. Neither spoke. Then, someone called his name. A cluster of men approached, railroad partners no doubt. Marcus hesitated before stepping away. He did not return the tray. The evening stretched on, filled with laughter and clinking silver. Eleanor resumed her tasks with the numb grace of survival. Yet every time she looked up, she found his gaze upon her, steady, unreadable, unwavering. And then, near the end of the evening, as guests began to drift toward the gardens for cigars and brandy, he passed beside her once more. This time he stopped. He leaned in, not close enough to touch her, but close enough to steal her breath. His voice, low and deliberate, brushed against her ear like velvet. "You will be mine." She stood frozen, the words echoing through her like the notes of a requiem, and the first chords of something dangerously new. The morning sun filtered through sheer muslin curtains, casting a pale golden glow over the modest room on the second floor of the boarding house. The delicate light did little to warm the chilled air, or the heavy silence that lingered in the small parlour where Mrs. Lydia Hayes sat stiffly, reading the society column of the Newport Herald. Her gloved fingers, though tremulous, gripped the paper with the dignity of a woman who refused to surrender entirely to shame. Seen together near the gardens, he whispered something that left her shaken. Lydia read aloud, her voice brittle. "Mr. Marcus Vanderbilt, heir to one of Newport's most prominent dynasties, was observed in close proximity to an unnamed domestic servant believed to be Miss Eleanor Hayes, formerly of Touro Street." She folded the paper with painful precision, as though each crease might contain the force of her restraint. Across the room, Eleanor stood at the window, arms crossed tightly over her bodice, her profile drawn in sharp relief against the light. Her chestnut hair, unadorned, was pinned neatly at her nape. Her dress, plain blue calico, held no trace of the grandeur she had once known, and yet there was a stillness in her bearing, an unspoken defiance that time and scandal had not managed to extinguish. "They make it sound as if I seduced him," she said quietly, her voice low and even. "As if I went there with the intention of disgracing myself. They don't need facts, Eleanor. Only whispers." Lydia rose slowly and placed the paper on the small tea table. "This is the cost of falling from grace. You know that." Eleanor's eyes did not move from the street below. Horse-drawn carriages passed in the distance, their wheels clattering against cobblestones. The world, it seemed, continued unbothered by her name, being dragged through drawing rooms like so much gossip-stained linen. "I didn't say a word to him all evening," she murmured, "except to apologize for the broken glass." "But he spoke to you," Lydia's gaze sharpened, "and that's all the world needed to see." A knock on the door startled them both. Eleanor turned first, but it was Lydia who answered. Standing in the hallway was a young boy in a delivery cap, holding a white envelope sealed in red wax. "For Miss Hayes," he said, eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and mischief, "from the Vanderbilt estate." The wax bore the distinctive V emblem. Eleanor did not move as Lydia accepted the letter. The door closed behind the boy with a soft click that echoed like thunder in the silence that followed. Lydia handed the letter to her daughter, watching her closely. "It may be nothing." "It's not nothing." Eleanor's fingers hovered over the seal. "It never is with people like him." She broke the wax slowly and removed the folded parchment. The handwriting was masculine, precise, without embellishment. As she read, her breath stilled. Her mother crossed the room, her skirts rustling softly, and sat down once more. "Well?" Lydia asked. Eleanor lowered the letter and looked at her. "He's offered me a position. A position as his personal secretary at the summer estate." Lydia's breath caught. Not as a servant? No. Eleanor swallowed hard. He says I would be responsible for managing correspondence, organizing ledgers, overseeing estate accounts during the remaining season. Lydia was silent for a moment. That's no small offer. No, it's not. Eleanor's voice trembled at the edges, though her spine remained straight. It's generous, or calculated. Her mother's tone cooled. You must not forget who he is, Eleanor, and who you are in his eyes. Eleanor turned toward the window again, though her hands clutched the letter. He didn't look at me like the others did. That's what makes it dangerous. They sat in silence. A nearby clock chimed once. In another house, they might have had the luxury of time. Here, time was currency, and they were nearly bankrupt. Do you trust him? Lydia asked at last. I don't know him, Eleanor replied honestly. But you want to. Eleanor hesitated. I want to not be powerless. That afternoon, she rode to the estate not in shame, but with quiet resolve. The carriage was borrowed from a neighbor and smelled faintly of old leather and roses gone dry. She carried no trunk, only a carpet bag with her writing tools, a spare dress, and her mother's shawl. Her hands remained folded as the gates of the Vanderbilt estate appeared once again before her, rising like some ancient citadel of fortune. This time she did not enter through the servants' wing. A maid led her to the east wing, where sunlight poured through stained-glass windows and gleamed against polished floors. The corridor was lined with oil portraits, men with iron gazes, and women with impossibly delicate wrists, painted in brushstrokes of legacy and expectation. She was ushered into a study panelled in dark walnut, its shelves filled with ledgers and leather-bound volumes. Maps hung above the hearth. The air smelled of ink, smoke, and the faintest trace of bergamot. Marcus Vanderbilt stood by the window, back turned. He did not glance up immediately, as if aware that his silence was a kind of power. When he did turn, his expression was unreadable. Miss Hayes. His voice was smooth, unhurried. Thank you for coming. She stepped forward, neither meek nor bold, and met his gaze. You made it difficult to refuse. I don't like to be ignored. His mouth curved faintly. And I admire efficiency. I came to hear the terms, she said, not to flatter your pride. Then let me be clear. He crossed the room slowly, hands clasped behind his back. I have more correspondences than I care to admit. My associates are multiplying by the day, and my summer staff is trained in embroidery and discretion, but not arithmetic. I need someone who can read between the lines, someone I can trust. Her chin lifted slightly. Why me? He paused. Because you've already lost everything. That makes you honest. The answer stung more than she let on. I won't be bought, she said quietly. If that is your intention, you'll have to find someone else. I don't buy people, he replied, his tone calm. Only time and silence. There was a stillness between them, heavy with unspoken tension. Eleanor lowered her eyes briefly, then raised them again. Then you'll have both, for a fair wage, and nothing more. He studied her, the way one might examine a rare coin worn at the edges. Not for value, but for origin. At last he inclined his head. Very well, the wage will be respectable. You'll have your own quarters. The work begins tomorrow. She turned to go. Eleanor. She froze. He had not used her name before. She turned cautiously. He was closer than she expected. I'm not asking for anything more than your skill and your loyalty. His voice dropped a note. But people will say otherwise. I know. He took a step nearer, not touching her, but near enough for her breath to catch. Do you fear that? He asked. I fear only giving the world a reason to whisper. He gave a slow, unreadable smile. We'll see. And with that, he turned away, leaving her heart thudding in a rhythm she did not welcome, yet could not deny. The east wing of the Vanderbilt estate stood in elegant silence, far removed from the murmur of guests and the glint of crystal chandeliers. Here, among tall windows draped in damask and hallways lined with imported marble, Eleanor Hayes took her first steps into a life she had never imagined would be offered back to her. Not as a guest, not as a debutante, but as a woman of function and quiet necessity. She had risen early that morning, long before the house stirred, and dressed in a slate-grey walking dress of modest cut and fine but plain wool. The bodice was high-necked, adorned only with a single jet button at the collar, and the sleeves hugged her arms with restrained elegance. Though not lavish, it was no longer the garb of a servant. Her boots were clean, her gloves intact, and her hair pulled into a low chignon at the nape of her neck, neat, professional, unsentimental. The study where she worked was a sanctum of masculine order and inherited authority. Rich mahogany shelves cradled volumes with gold lettering, and green-shaded lamps cast pools of warm light over the massive desk she was now permitted to use. The room smelled of ink, tobacco, and the faint sweetness of sandalwood, remnants of Marcus Vanderbilt's presence which lingered even in his absence. Each morning, Eleanor transcribed dictated letters from his notes, copied out reports, and arranged incoming correspondence into meticulous categories. Her script, honed by years of genteel education, flowed with precision across the cream-colored paper. She worked silently, efficiently, and with the poised dignity of someone who knew how much of herself she had wagered for the right to sit at that desk. From time to time, he would appear without warning. She would glance up and find him standing in the doorway, coat unbuttoned, gloves removed, watching her with unreadable eyes. He rarely interrupted her, merely offered a curt nod before proceeding to his own desk, which faced hers at a discreet angle. They did not often speak of anything beyond business, but the air between them was never entirely still. It trembled with something unsaid. It was on the third afternoon of her new duties that she saw it clearly, how the weight of legacy rested on his shoulders like an invisible mantle. He stood at the fireplace, speaking with a visiting financier from Philadelphia, and though his voice was firm and commanding, Eleanor noticed the tightness around his mouth, the brief closing of his eyes when the man mentioned the Astor contracts, the way his jaw locked when asked about political aspirations. He was not merely a man of fortune. He was a man shaped by expectation, by bloodlines, by silent battles waged in rooms just like this one, where decisions were made with fountain pens instead of swords, and empires were built on the curve of a signature. That evening, long after the halls had quieted and the last coach had rolled away, she found herself still at the desk, sealing letters under lamplight. She was finishing the final envelope when she heard the soft creak of the door. She looked up. Marcus stood there alone, a glass of something amber in his hand, his cravat loosened just slightly, enough to betray the late hour and the long day. "You work too long," he said. She placed the seal down and straightened. There was still light. He stepped farther into the room. "Come with me." Eleanor hesitated, unsure whether to protest or obey. In the end, she followed him. They moved down the silent corridor and through the double doors that led into the garden. The night was mild, the air tinged with brine from the sea and the perfume of white roses that lined the gravel paths. Lanterns hung from wrought-iron posts, casting flickering halos along the marble benches and trimmed hedges. Moonlight shimmered on the fountain at the center of the garden, and the gentle splash of water was the only sound between them. He walked beside her in silence for several paces before stopping beneath a canopy of ivy. "Do you remember the Christmas ball of '89? He asked softly. Eleanor's breath caught. "Yes. You wore green velvet," he continued, looking toward the horizon, "with gold trim and a small emerald at your throat." Her heart fluttered. She hadn't thought anyone had noticed her that night. It had been one of the last evenings before everything had begun to unravel. "I remember you laughed," he added, "but not often. You were careful, like someone raised among wolves, pretending to be a swan." She turned her face slightly, uncertain whether his words were meant as admiration or something else. "I saw you dance with Thomas Redford," he continued, "and I wondered if he knew how easily he could break you." Her gaze sharpened. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I want you to know I saw you before the fall." His voice lowered, his eyes meeting hers. "Not as they see you now. Not as a servant. Not as gossip." The night felt suddenly closer around her, the scent of roses heavier. "But you said nothing then," she replied. "You danced with Beatrice Ashford." He gave a faint, sardonic smile, and regretted it before the orchestra reached the second refrain. She looked away, unsure how to hold his gaze without yielding something of herself. The wind stirred her skirts gently. "There are things I wish I had said," he murmured, "before the world became so loud." Eleanor stepped back slightly, needing distance, air, sense. She folded her arms, not in defiance but in self-preservation. "I'm not that girl anymore," she said. "The one in green velvet. She died the night they came for our house." He studied her carefully, as though measuring her for truth. "No," he said. "She learned how to survive." He left her then, without touch or promise, but the words he had spoken clung to her skin like the night's dew. The next morning, the world reasserted itself with all its sharp angles. She entered the study to find a new stack of correspondence awaiting her. As she sorted through the letters, invoices, and invitations, one envelope slipped from the pile and fell to the floor. She bent to retrieve it, her fingers brushing against thick, unsealed parchment tucked between the pages of a ledger. She paused. The letter was addressed not to Marcus, but from him. The recipient, Charles Hayes, her father. The date, 3 weeks before the collapse. Her pulse quickened. She unfolded the letter with care, her eyes scanning the slanted ink. The contents were brief but urgent. A warning, a plea. "I urge you not to sign with Ashford Consolidated. There are irregularities I cannot ignore. Your reputation and your assets may be in jeopardy. If you will allow me, I am prepared to assist you in redirecting the investment." She lowered the page slowly, her hands trembling. He had tried to warn her father. He had written, perhaps too late, perhaps intercepted, but he had not been the architect of their ruin. She held the letter in both hands, the weight of it far heavier than paper should allow. It was proof of something she had never dared hope for, that someone, somewhere, had cared enough to try, and that someone, it now seemed, was Marcus Vanderbilt. The letter sat like a wound upon Eleanor's desk. Though its ink had long since dried, it pulsed with new life in her hands, stirring emotions she had tried for years to silence. Her fingers, slender and pale beneath the morning light, traced the curve of her father's name on the envelope's edge, as if by touch alone she could reach across time and demand an answer. The study was hushed. Outside the windows, the estate stirred with its usual rhythm. Hooves clattered in the carriage yard, maids passed by carrying linens, and gardeners clipped at the hedgerows with steady precision. But within the east wing, where the grand oil paintings of forgotten ancestors watched in solemn silence, something fragile was breaking open. Eleanor rose from her chair, spine straight, despite the trembling in her core. She crossed the study with quiet purpose and stepped into the corridor, the letter still in her hand. Each footstep against the marble floor echoed like a bell of reckoning. She found Marcus in the sunroom, seated at a large oak table covered with estate ledgers and papers bearing the gold seal of Ashford Consolidated. He looked up when she entered, his brow arching at her storm cloud expression. "I need a word," she said, her voice low but unshaken. Marcus closed the ledger before him and gestured to the chair across from him, but she did not sit. Instead, she extended the letter. "I found this yesterday, between the pages of a ledger. You wrote to my father." Recognition flickered across his face like lightning across water. Slowly, he took the letter from her, eyes scanning its contents as if to confirm it still said what he remembered. "I did. And you never sent it?" "I did send it," he said carefully. "By courier. I kept a copy, in case it would one day be necessary." She crossed her arms over her chest, the fabric of her dress rustling softly. "Then why didn't he receive it?" Marcus stood now, closing the distance between them with quiet steps. "I believe he never had the chance. Charles trusted the Ashfords too quickly. They had more influence over his decisions than he realized. Eleanor's eyes searched his. "Are you saying Beatrice's father intercepted your warning?" "I don't have proof," he replied, "but I suspected as much at the time. By the time I confronted her father about the matter, your estate was already under seizure, and your name," his voice faltered slightly, "was already on every banker's blacklist in Providence." Eleanor turned away from him, facing the wide windows. The garden beyond was awash in gold and green, indifferent to the collapse of any man's legacy. "I want to believe you," she murmured, "but part of me wonders if you sent the letter knowing it would never reach him, if you, like the others, stood ready to devour what remained of us." There was a pause. The silence was not cold, but dense with the weight of things unsaid. "I stood by," Marcus admitted, "because I was told it was too late, and perhaps because I didn't know where the line between mercy and interference lay, but I never wished your father harm. And I never thought I'd see you brought so low." Eleanor's shoulders stiffened at that last line, pride flaring like a shield. "Don't pity me." "I don't," he said softly. "I admire you." She turned then, and their eyes met, hers burning with hurt, his shadowed with something harder to name. Before either could speak again, a sharp knock at the door interrupted the moment. It was Mrs. Whitcomb, the housekeeper, flanked by two maids who looked deeply uncomfortable. "Pardon me, sir," she said, clutching something in her hand, wrapped in a white handkerchief. "We've found a matter that requires your attention." Eleanor stepped aside as Mrs. Whitcomb approached the table and unfolded the handkerchief to reveal a glittering object nestled within the folds of linen, a brooch of deep blue sapphires rimmed with pearls. "That piece belongs to Miss Ashford," the housekeeper announced gravely. "It was discovered in Miss Hayes's quarters, tucked beneath her pillow." Eleanor's breath caught. Her heart pounded in her ears, not from guilt, but from the cold, calculated familiarity of this cruelty. "I never saw that brooch before in my life," she said clearly. Mrs. Whitcomb hesitated. "The servants, well, they don't want to speak ill, but there was mention of Miss Ashford visiting yesterday. Briefly." "Without my knowledge," Marcus said sharply. The air in the room thickened with discomfort. "Bring Beatrice to me," he ordered. "Now." But Eleanor shook her head. "No," she said firmly. "Don't summon her. You won't change her nature with accusations. She's done this because she wants to see me thrown out with my name dragged lower than it's ever been." Marcus studied her face, then looked to the brooch again before speaking. "Return this to its rightful owner, discreetly. There will be no accusations, and Miss Hayes's room will be moved to the inner wing." The maids curtsied and departed quickly. Mrs. Whitcomb gave Eleanor a fleeting look, of sympathy or suspicion she couldn't tell, then followed. Once they were alone again, Eleanor exhaled slowly. "She'll only try again," she said. "Let her," Marcus replied. "But understand this, Eleanor. You are walking a very fine line in this house. Whatever protection I can offer you, it will never be enough to silence them all. One misstep—" "I don't need your protection," she interrupted, her voice quivering more from pride than fear. "I need the truth, and perhaps a place in this world where I am not always hunted." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Marcus stepped forward, his voice low, steady. "If that place exists, I will help you find it, even if it costs me the approval of every last name on my guest list." She did not thank him. Gratitude was too thin a word for the storm of feelings crashing beneath her ribs. That night, the storm outside echoed the one within her. Rain lashed the windows, and thunder rolled across the bay. Eleanor returned late from the study, her hair damp from the sea mist, her shawl clutched around her shoulders. She reached the door to her chamber, and stopped. The handle did not turn. Locked. She tried again. Nothing. Her candle flickered dangerously in the breeze, and a drop of rain slid down her neck. She was just about to knock when a voice spoke behind her. "Miss Hayes." She turned to see Marcus standing at the end of the corridor, coat unfastened, hair tousled as if he too had been caught in the wind. "You're locked out," he observed. "It would appear so." His expression darkened. "Come. The drawing room has a fire lit." Too weary to protest, she followed him down the hall. The drawing room was warm, its hearth crackling with amber flame. The curtains were drawn, and a chess set lay abandoned on a nearby table. Eleanor moved to the fire, stretching her fingers toward the warmth. Marcus removed his gloves, then sat in the chair opposite her. His left hand was wrapped in linen, a small bloom of red seeping through. "You're hurt." "Fencing accident this morning," he said with a dismissive gesture, "a careless parry." "Let me see." He extended his hand. She knelt beside him, unwrapping the linen slowly. Her fingers were gentle, sure. The cut was not deep, but it ran across the base of his thumb, a clean, deliberate line. "You fence to win, I imagine," she murmured. "I fence to remember I can still lose." She looked up, startled. Their faces were close now, the fire casting flickers of light across his cheekbones and the faint scar near his jaw. His breath was warm, touched with something floral and spiced, tea, perhaps, or brandy. Her hands stilled, their eyes locked. The air between them shifted. No words, no promises, only the thrum of hearts exposed beneath layers of formality and fear. His hand moved slightly, not to grasp her, but to rest beside hers, a silent offering. She drew in a breath, one that caught in her throat like silk against skin. And then, slowly, deliberately, she stood. "I'll see to your bandage," she said softly, and he let her go. The scent of crushed roses and beeswax polish lingered in the air as the Vanderbilt estate prepared for the most anticipated event of the season, the annual Harvest Ball. Every year, society's finest descended upon Newport for one last evening of splendor before the autumn winds turned sharp and the coastal mansions were shuttered for the winter. But this year, the anticipation held a peculiar note, an undercurrent of whispers that had little to do with gowns or orchestras. In the East Wing, Eleanor stood before a full-length mirror framed in carved walnut, watching her reflection with a mix of disbelief and dread. The gown she wore was pale lavender silk, softened with age but restored with exquisite care. Tiny mother-of-pearl buttons ran from her waist to the curve of her collarbone, and the sleeves, slightly puffed at the shoulders, ended in delicate lace at her wrists. It had once belonged to her mother, worn in Paris in another lifetime. Now it belonged to a woman forged by loss. Behind her, Mrs. Lydia Hayes sat quietly on a cushioned stool, mending the final hem. "It fits you better than it ever fit me," she said softly, though her voice trembled with emotion. Eleanor met her mother's gaze in the mirror. "Do you think it's foolish?" "I think it's brave," Lydia replied. "You're walking into a room full of people who watched us fall. Let them see how well we rise." A knock interrupted them. One of the maids entered, eyes wide with awe. "Mr. Vanderbilt sends his compliments. The carriage is ready." The ride from the boarding house to the Vanderbilt estate was short, but Eleanor felt every second stretch like a thread pulled too tightly. Her gloves were simple, ivory kid leather. She wore no jewelry, save for a small locket that had once belonged to her grandmother. Her hair had been swept into a loose chignon with two soft tendrils framing her face. It was a face no longer untouched by sorrow, but tempered by it, and perhaps made lovelier because of it. The estate was ablaze with light. Hundreds of lanterns lined the pathways, flickering like stars fallen to earth. The sound of violins floated on the night air, and carriages arrived in procession one after another, releasing ladies in gowns of velvet and tulle, their laughter ringing like wind chimes above the gravel. Eleanor descended slowly, heart thudding, and was led not through the servants' entrance but the front doors, gilded and arched, thrown open in welcome. Her name was not announced. She wore no title, no inheritance, yet still she entered. Inside, the ballroom glittered like a dream spun from gold and glass. The walls, painted in soft ivory, shimmered under the glow of chandeliers, and garlands of autumn leaves wove through the columns. The crowd, wealthy men in crisp black tailcoats, women in gowns the color of wine, emerald and midnight, parted slightly at the sight of her. Their gazes lingered, curious and sharp. She had been expected, and they were eager to feast on scandal. But before the first whisper could spread, Marcus Vanderbilt appeared at her side. He wore a formal black tailcoat with satin lapels, his white waistcoat and bow tie crisp, every line of his frame precise. His hair was neatly combed, but one unruly wave near his temple betrayed the late hour and the heat of the crowd. His eyes, though, never wavered. "You look," he said, offering his arm, "unforgettable." Eleanor hesitated for a breath before placing her gloved hand on his. "You realize what they'll say. I'm counting on it." They crossed the floor together, and though no music paused, though no announcement was made, every head turned. A path opened before them, and Eleanor felt the weight of 100 judgments pressing against her skin. She held her head high. When the orchestra shifted into a Strauss waltz, Marcus did not ask. He simply led her onto the floor. His hand settled at her waist, firm but careful. Their bodies moved in practiced rhythm, though they had never danced together before. Her gown swirled softly with each turn, and as he spun her beneath the light of 1,000 crystals, time loosened its grip. "You're very quiet," he murmured, eyes never leaving hers. "I'm counting how many knives are pointed at my back." He smiled faintly. "Let them try. You've already endured more than they ever could." They danced in silence after that, save for the music that rose and fell around them like a tide. When the waltz ended, Marcus bowed and kissed her gloved hand with solemn grace. The gesture sent a ripple through the crowd. Not far from the dance floor, Beatrice Ashford stood beneath a cluster of lanterns, her lips curved into a smile too sharp to be called pleasant. She was clad in emerald satin, a jeweled comb glittering in her hair, and a cluster of young men surrounded her, each eager to be seen beside her, though none truly wanted to be near the ice beneath her gaze. "Well," she said aloud, though her voice was pitched perfectly to carry, "it seems charity balls are no longer scheduled on the calendar. They come straight into our ballrooms now." Laughter followed, brittle and forced. Eleanor turned her head slightly, hearing it, but said nothing. Marcus did. With one smooth movement, he stepped away from Eleanor and approached Beatrice. "Miss Ashford," he said evenly, "it's comforting to know your tongue is as sharp as ever. It must be exhausting, keeping it honed on other people's reputations." She blinked, feigning confusion. "Why, Marcus? I only meant to congratulate you. I hear redemption is in fashion this season." He smiled thinly. "Then allow me to be the first to say you are terribly out of style." He returned to Eleanor and offered his arm once more. Together, they walked toward the veranda, leaving the laughter behind them. Outdoors, the night had cooled. The air carried a hint of brine and distant chimney smoke. Lanterns cast soft golden halos along the railing. Eleanor stepped away from the crowd, finding a quiet corner beneath a willow tree whose branches trembled in the breeze. Marcus joined her moments later, offering her a glass of chilled champagne. She accepted it silently, but did not drink. "This isn't a game," she said softly. "I know. They'll never forget what you did tonight. I don't want them to." Their eyes met again, and in that gaze the world seemed to narrow into something deeper than mere attraction. It was recognition, two souls marked by weight and shadow, reaching through the silence that surrounded them. He stepped closer. "You were never invisible to me, Eleanor, not even when you wished to be." Her breath hitched. Her heart had been guarded for so long, it hardly knew how to beat freely. "Then why did you wait so long?" "Because I didn't know if I deserved your anger more than I desired your forgiveness." And before she could answer, his hand rose to touch her cheek, not with force but reverence. His thumb traced a line just beneath her jaw, and then he bent slowly, so slowly, and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was not possessive. It was not loud. It was an answer whispered in the dark. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his coat, and her eyes closed. When they finally pulled apart, the lantern light shimmered in her eyes like tears. "I should go inside," she whispered. "I won't stop you," he said, "but I won't forget this moment, even if you do." She turned, her heart thudding, and walked back into the ballroom with her pulse singing like a violin string. Inside, in the study near the west corridor, a private door opened. Charles Ashford, a man whose name carried weight in every bank and boardroom from Boston to New York, stepped into the firelit room where Marcus had just returned. He held a snifter of brandy and smiled without warmth. "Lovely evening," he said. "You do know how to make a statement." Marcus didn't respond. "I'll make mine simple," Ashford continued, swirling the amber liquid. "If I see your name beside hers again, at a dinner, a function, a receipt of engagement, I will release the files from the Hathaway deal, every one of them." Marcus's jaw clenched. Ashford raised his glass in mock salute. "Sometimes, Marcus," he said with a smirk, "men like us must choose between desire and survival." And then he turned and vanished into the shadows, leaving behind a silence far colder than the autumn wind. A thin veil of fog curled over the coast as the morning tide rolled into Newport. The city's elegant facades gleamed pale beneath a muted sky, their grandeur untouched by the quiet cruelty that often festered behind lace-draped windows and carved oak doors. In that world of hushed parlor conversations and carefully measured glances, reputations were traded like currency, and whispers could cost more than gold. It had been 3 days since Marcus had left for New York. His departure had been abrupt, but necessary. Urgent correspondence from the Hathaway Group demanded his presence at a private board meeting concerning railway expansion in Connecticut. He left instructions for Eleanor to continue managing correspondence in his absence, and reminded her, in a tone that was nearly tender, to take her walks in the garden before the weather turned. Eleanor had nodded politely, though her heart had tugged with an emotion she would not name. Now, with his absence echoing through the empty corridors of the East Wing, the silence grew heavier with each passing hour. It began subtly. A maid stopped meeting her gaze in the morning hallway. The cook, who once smiled as she passed through the kitchens, now kept her head down and spoke in hushed tones. By the second evening, 2 invitations arrived for Marcus, both accompanied by carefully worded notes requesting clarification about the status of Miss Hayes and whether she would be continuing her duties in the manner observed at the Harvest Ball. On the 3rd day, Mrs. Lydia Hayes opened a folded paper slipped beneath their boarding house door. There was no signature, no official seal, just a brief, brutal message printed in block letters: "You have 30 days to vacate." When Eleanor arrived home that evening, her mother was seated by the hearth, the letter gripped tightly in her hand. Her face was pale, her lips drawn tight as thread. "It's from no one," she said before Eleanor could ask. "Which means it's from everyone." Eleanor took the paper slowly, read it once, then again. Her fingers did not tremble, but something inside her did. "The landlady has always been kind," she whispered. "Kindness fades when pressure rises," her mother replied bitterly. "They've all turned their backs." The next morning, Eleanor rose early and walked alone to 3 of the city's former acquaintances. Families who once dined in her father's parlor, who had once called her by her name with affection, admiration even. The First Lady received her with a strained smile and insisted her husband was away. The second kept her waiting in the entry hall, only to send a butler with a note saying, "Our household cannot involve itself in difficult matters at this time." The third, an old friend of her father's, shook his head solemnly as he walked her to the door. "My dear," he said not unkindly, "you've become complicated." By nightfall, the whispers were no longer whispers. They had grown legs, mouths, eyes. Beatrice Ashford, ever gracious in her venom, had told several families over card games and tea that Eleanor Hayes had traded her morning gown for influence, that her reappearance at the Harvest Ball had been orchestrated, and that Marcus Vanderbilt, once so wise in his social associations, had now become blind to manipulation wrapped in silk. None of it was said in public, of course, but Newport society had never needed witnesses to execute a verdict. Eleanor returned to the estate late that evening, her steps slow, her gloves damp from the mist, only to find her room stripped bare. Her writing desk had been moved, her belongings stacked neatly in the hallway, as though she were a package to be delivered elsewhere. The housekeeper, Mrs. Whitcomb, met her with pursed lips. "You've been relieved of your post, Miss Hayes." "By whose order?" "I received word from Mr. Pembroke." Eleanor's breath hitched. "Mr. Pembroke is not Mr. Vanderbilt." The housekeeper shifted uncomfortably. "He spoke with authority. I had no choice." There was no scene, no raised voice. Eleanor gathered her things quietly, her face composed. She left a note for Marcus on the desk where she had once worked, though she doubted he would ever see it. That same night, as rain began to fall over Manhattan, Marcus Vanderbilt stood on the balcony of a private club near Madison Square, oblivious to the storm unraveling back home. A telegram from his housekeeper, delayed by a postal error, waited unopened on a silver tray in his private suite. It was only the next morning, as he sipped his coffee and opened the note, that his expression changed. Within an hour, he was on a train bound for Rhode Island. By the time the estate gates reappeared, the sun had already begun its descent behind the slate-grey clouds, casting the mansion in a bruised light. Marcus did not stop to greet the staff. He stormed into the main hall, his coat still damp with travel, and barked a single command. "Where is she?" No one had an answer. When he discovered Eleanor had been dismissed, without his knowledge, without his consent, his fury was quiet, but thunderous. He mounted his horse without changing clothes and rode through the damp streets of Newport until he arrived at the Ashfords' grand mansion, its wrought iron gates as imperious as the family within. A footman attempted to stop him at the door. Marcus brushed past. He found Beatrice and her father seated in the blue drawing-room, discussing something over port and candied walnuts. They looked up as he entered. "Marcus," Beatrice purred, rising slowly, "you should have sent word." "You had her dismissed," he said, his voice low and sharp. Beatrice blinked with feigned innocence. "I'm afraid I don't know who you mean." "You know exactly who I mean." Her father rose from his chair, clearing his throat. "You're speaking of Miss Hayes," he said smoothly, "a woman whose presence has complicated matters for many of us." Marcus advanced a step. "I gave no order for her removal." "No," said Beatrice, "but you left a vacuum, and we merely filled it, for your own good." He turned his gaze to her fully now, eyes narrowed. "You've been poisoning every ear in Newport." "I've been protecting your name," she countered. "Do you think the Hathaway board will accept you with her draped on your arm? Do you think Washington won't raise an eyebrow? Her reputation is tattered. Her family is bankrupt. Her presence—" "Enough!" The word fell like an axe. But Beatrice was not done. "There's a solution," she said softly, stepping toward him. "Marry me, Marcus. Let this all go. I can restore the Hayes name, quiet the whispers, control the damage." Behind her, her father nodded. "You marry Beatrice," he added, "and the documents from Hathaway, the ones tied to your father's final investments, will remain exactly where they are, quiet, safe." Marcus stared at them, as if seeing them for what they truly were for the first time. Not allies, not peers, but parasites dressed in brocade. And then, from the doorway, a sound. He turned. Eleanor stood there. Her cloak was soaked through, her bonnet askew. Her cheeks were pale, and her eyes, those eyes, were wide and wounded. "I came to return something," she said quietly, her voice like glass. She held out a leather-bound book, Marcus's ledger. "I thought I'd forgotten to take it with me, but I hadn't. I just wanted to see." Her gaze flicked to Beatrice, then to Mr. Ashford, and then finally to Marcus. "I understand everything now." She turned before he could speak, before he could cross the room, and slipped out into the night. And this time, she left no note. The rain fell in fine, steady lines, as if the sky itself had grown weary of the silence that had settled over Newport. The city's elegance, so proudly paraded in summer, now dulled beneath the weight of autumn. Windows were shuttered, gardens stripped bare by wind, and the carriages that once carried laughter now rolled past quietly, their lamps flickering in the mist. Marcus Vanderbilt rode alone, his coat drenched, his gloves stained from clutching the reins too tightly. His horse, slick with rain and sweat, moved at a steady pace, tracing the same streets for the third time that day. Each shop front he passed, each alleyway he scanned, offered only shadows. No sign of her, no trace. Eleanor had vanished. In the days since her disappearance from the Ashford mansion, he had searched without rest. He had questioned the boarding house staff, visited dressmakers, laundries, schools, even the smaller churches. Anywhere a woman of education and dignity might have gone to hide her name. But Eleanor was too clever to be found easily. She knew which doors he would knock on, so she had chosen the ones he wouldn't think to open. But Marcus was not a man who surrendered to silence. By the 6th day, his boots were worn from walking, his patience frayed from the weight of unsaid apologies, and yet he kept searching. At the edge of Newport, in a neighborhood where the cobblestones gave way to dirt and the gas lamps flickered unevenly, a small dress shop stood behind an iron gate. Its windows were fogged, its roof patched with tin. The painted sign above the door had once read, "Miss Parker's Sewing and Repair," but the "and" had faded, and now it simply read, "Sewing Repair." Inside, behind a curtain of muslin and spools of faded thread, Eleanor Hayes worked quietly beneath a dim oil lamp. Her name there was not Eleanor. It was Miss Ellen Marsh, a seamstress with no family, no connections, and no past. She wore her hair tucked into a tight bun, covered by a modest bonnet. Her hands, though still graceful, bore tiny pricks and calluses. She earned little, but paid her rent on time. She kept to herself and did not speak unless spoken to. The neighborhood women, mostly widows and washerwomen, found her pleasant but distant. She had chosen this life not out of shame, but survival. She had seen what charity did to women. It made them small, grateful, silent. She would not be rescued, not even by him. On the morning of the fire, Eleanor was bent over a child's dress, stitching a torn hem, when a boy burst into the shop, breathless and wild-eyed. "Ma'am, it's the boarding house on Truro Street. There's fire coming from the roof." Eleanor dropped the garment instantly, her needle clattering to the floor. She didn't wait to explain. She didn't even grab her cloak. Her feet were already pounding the muddy street, skirts soaked and lungs burning, as she ran back toward the place that had once been her only refuge. By the time she reached the hill, smoke was already rising in thick black columns. Flames licked at the top floor, the roof groaning beneath the pressure. Men shouted, forming a line with buckets from the well, and women screamed names into the wind. "Mother," Eleanor cried, pushing through the crowd. "Has anyone seen my mother?" No one answered. Then a voice broke through the chaos. "She's still inside." Eleanor's blood froze. Before she could move, another figure surged through the smoke. Tall, dark, unrecognizable at first, until she saw the torn edge of the overcoat, the familiar boots, the profile she could never forget. Marcus. He threw himself through the front doors without hesitation, disappearing into the blaze just as the structure gave a low, angry moan. The crowd gasped. Eleanor stood frozen, heart pounding in her ears, the world tilting beneath her feet. She wanted to scream, to run after him, but strong arms held her back, someone she didn't know murmuring, "You can't go in there, miss, it's not safe." Then, through the smoke, a shadow emerged. Marcus staggered out, coughing violently, one arm wrapped around a fragile figure. Mrs. Hayes, wrapped in a blanket, her grey hair singed but intact. He collapsed to his knees just as Eleanor reached them. "Mother," she whispered, tears spilling freely now. "I'm fine," Lydia croaked, dazed. He pulled me from the bed. I didn't even know." Eleanor looked to Marcus. His face was streaked with soot, his hair damp with sweat. But his eyes, those eyes, found hers. "You fool," she said, her voice breaking. "You could have died." He managed a breathless smile. "You always said I never thought things through." She let out a laugh that was half a sob, half fury. The fire brigade moved around them. People were shouting, clapping, pointing. But all Eleanor could see was the man before her, the man she had fled, feared, resented, and never stopped remembering. Later, once Lydia had been taken to the neighbour's home to rest, Eleanor found Marcus sitting alone on the low wall near the church steps, his coat wrapped around his shoulders, his hands still black with ash. She approached slowly, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. "You didn't have to do it," she said. He didn't turn. "I know." "Then why?" He looked up at her. "Because I had to see you again, and I had nothing left to trade for your forgiveness, except my own life." She sat beside him, letting the silence stretch between them like a worn thread. "I didn't ask to be saved. I know that too. I wasn't waiting for you. I was never brave enough to expect that you would." She turned to face him fully, her voice trembling with the force of everything she'd held back. "You humiliated me. You let them treat me like something cheap. You left. And they—" "I know." His voice cracked, not with weakness, but surrender. "I was wrong, Eleanor. I thought I could protect you without standing beside you. I thought if I gave you space, the world would forget. But the world doesn't forget women like you. It punishes them. And I stood too far away to stop it." She looked down, her gloves clenched in her lap. He continued, softer now. "I don't want to own you, Eleanor. I don't want to fix you. I just want to stand where you are, with you, if you'll let me." She inhaled, slow and deep, as if the air itself might carry away the ache inside her. "Marcus." She turned toward him, tears welling but unshed. "We cannot begin again in ruins." He nodded, his throat working to swallow the weight of her words. "Then we'll build something new," he said, "not on ashes, but on truth." And in the fading light of that smoky afternoon, they did not kiss. They did not make promises. But she let her head fall gently against his shoulder, and he let his hand brush the back of hers, and it was enough, for now. The winds of late October swept through Newport with a sharpness that seemed to cleanse the streets of their pretense. The gilded facades, the clipped hedgerows, the towering mansions, everything remained in place, but something beneath the surface had shifted. The city, once so certain of its hierarchy, had begun to murmur a different tune. Whispers had turned to questions. Questions had become speculation. And speculation, in the hands of the right men, could topple dynasties. Marcus Vanderbilt sat alone in his study, the golden seal of the Providence Gazette open before him. The ink was still fresh, the headline bold. "Ashford Scandal Unveiled. Veterans' Funds Misappropriated for Private Investments." Below it, the details unfolded with precision and quiet fury. For over a year, Charles Ashford had redirected funds meant for widows and wounded soldiers into high-risk ventures under shell companies bearing fabricated names. The paper did not speculate. Marcus had ensured they published evidence, letters, contracts, names. He had waited to reveal it. Too long, perhaps, but timing, in the Gilded Age, was as valuable as gold. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closed briefly as the weight of the decision settled over him. He had known of the embezzlement for months, known that exposing it would destroy one of Newport's most powerful families, and with them the fragile balance of alliances that had once protected his own inheritance. But that balance had shifted the night Eleanor walked out of his reach. He no longer needed the approval of men like Ashford. He needed the truth, and her. That afternoon, the news spread like fire through drawing rooms and tea parlours. Women clutched pearls in mock horror. Men who had once toasted with Ashford now whispered of concerns and reputational exposure. Beatrice, once Newport's queen in emerald satin and glass smiles, found herself uninvited to luncheons, her name struck from guest lists with the same elegance she had once used to ruin others. By twilight, the Ashford carriage rolled out of town. No one waved goodbye. In a quieter part of Newport, Far from the scandalous echoes of parlours and social clubs, Eleanor walked alone through the cemetery gates. The air was cool, the earth damp beneath her boots, and the trees overhead rustled with brittle, falling leaves. She found the grave easily. Second row, third stone from the south wall. The lettering had begun to fade. Charles R. Hayes, devoted husband and father, 1839-1891. She stood for a long moment in silence, the wind tugging at her coat. Then slowly she knelt. "I carried your name like a burden," she whispered, her voice shaking, "like a curse that followed me into every room." Her fingers brushed the moss growing at the base of the stone. "But it wasn't your failure. It was theirs. The men who deceived you, the ones who let you fall." A pause, a breath. "And I forgive you. Not because you asked it, but because I can't carry this grief anymore." She closed her eyes and let her hand rest on the cold stone for a moment longer before rising. As she turned to leave, she saw her mother standing near the gate, her shawl drawn tight around her shoulders, eyes watchful. Lydia said nothing until they were walking side by side. "You always feared they would define you," she said softly, "but they only gave you something to rise above." Eleanor looked over at her, her gaze tender and tired. "I don't know if I have the strength to hope again." "You don't need strength for hope, child," Lydia answered. "You just need to stop fearing joy." That night, as clouds gathered low over the bay and the lamps in town blinked one by one to life, a note arrived for Eleanor. It was written in Marcus's hand, simple and unadorned. "Dinner, 8 o'clock, not a ball, no eyes but mine." She read it once, then again. Her heart, cautious but no longer closed, stirred. At 7:30, she stepped out of her mother's small parlour in a gown of deep plum, simple, long-sleeved, with a row of buttons down the back and a velvet ribbon at the waist. Her hair was swept up gently, a few tendrils loose at her temples. No necklace, no earrings, only the quiet confidence of a woman who had earned her place. When she arrived at the Vanderbilt estate, she expected grandeur, but what she found was intimacy. The main hall was dimly lit, the chandeliers above left untouched. Only the dining room glowed with the soft warmth of candlelight and the crackle of a low fire. The table was set for two. Marcus stood at the far end, not in formal wear, but in a dark dinner coat and open collar, his hair brushed but not sculpted. He looked up when she entered, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. "You came," he said, voice low. "You asked." He offered his arm, and she took it without hesitation. Dinner passed not in grand declarations, but in quiet conversation. They spoke of books, of travel, of her work at the shop and his frustration with board meetings, of her mother's health, of the wind over the coast. It was not romantic, it was real. After the final course, a warm plum tart, was cleared, Marcus rose and walked to the small cabinet near the fireplace. "I don't have diamonds," he said without turning. "Not tonight. You deserve more than something weighed in carats." When he returned, he held a small velvet box. She opened it slowly. Inside lay a pocket watch, her father's, restored, polished, whole. She gasped softly, fingers trembling as she lifted it from the box. "I found it," Marcus said, "months ago, at a pawn shop on Whitaker Street. I had it repaired. I wanted to give it to you when it mattered most." She opened the lid. Inside, where once had been only brass, a tiny inscription had been engraved, "For time lost and time regained." Her eyes filled with tears. She looked up. "Why now?" "Because I know who you are," he said, stepping closer, "and I know what I am, and I would rather spend the rest of my life earning your forgiveness than the rest of it regretting your absence." She stood very still, her hand around the watch. "Are you asking me to be yours?" "I'm asking you to be you, in my home, at my table, beside me, but never behind." Eleanor's breath caught. Her fingers still curled around the warm metal. Her voice, when it came, was steady, even if her heart was not. "Then ask." He took her hand. "Eleanor Hayes, will you begin again with me?" She nodded, Once, a tear slipping free. Yes. And in the quiet glow of that firelit room with no music and no witnesses, they stepped not into a fairy tale, but into something truer. A beginning, at last. The morning mist clung gently to the cliffs above Brenton Point, wrapping the craggy rocks in a veil of white, as though nature itself wished to lend privacy to the modest gathering atop the hill. Below, the Atlantic whispered against the shore, its rhythm steady, eternal. And high above, in a clearing bordered by wildflowers and wind-worn grasses, a circle of chairs faced the sea. There were no grand floral arrangements, no string quartets, no chandeliers suspended in tents of silk. But there was sunlight and sincerity, and the kind of hush that settles over a moment long awaited. Eleanor stood with her hands lightly folded in front of her, a small bouquet of white peonies and rosemary held against the bodice of her gown. The dress was simple, ivory muslin trimmed in antique lace, repurposed from her mother's wedding veil. It moved softly in the breeze, catching the light in ripples. Her hair was gathered at her nape with a satin ribbon the color of sea foam, and her cheeks, usually pale, held the soft hue of one who had not only been seen, but chosen. Across from her stood Marcus Vanderbilt, solemn in a charcoal-grey morning coat, his eyes never leaving hers. His cravat was loosely knotted, the wind tugging at the edge of his lapel, but his stance was composed, sure. His expression held none of the guarded calculation that once defined him. Today, he looked like a man unburdened. They were joined by only a handful of witnesses. Lydia Hayes, seated in a woven chair beside the minister, her shawl wrapped neatly over her shoulders. A few close friends of Marcus from the estate. 2 young girls from Eleanor's school who clutched small bunches of daisies in trembling hands. There were no titles exchanged, no choreographed procession. Only vows spoken with voices that trembled not from uncertainty, but from reverence. When Marcus placed the ring upon Eleanor's finger, a slender band of gold, engraved inside with the date and the words, "Not because, but despite," she looked up at him and smiled. It was the first smile she had given him without sorrow behind it. They kissed, not for show, not for the eyes of those around them, but with the quiet intimacy of a promise sealed. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the wind rose, and the sea sang in approval. The following weeks brought changes not only to their household, but to Newport itself. At first the whispers returned. Of course they did. "Did you hear?" they said over china teacups and garden gates. "He married her after all. On the cliffs. Can you imagine?" But this time the whispers were not soaked in scorn. They were tinged with awe. Eleanor Hayes, now Mrs. Vanderbilt, had not re-entered society through the back door. She had stood before them with dignity, married without spectacle, and refused to become what so many expected of her, a silent trophy. Within a fortnight, the old boarding house on Touro Street, though charred and uninhabitable, was purchased under Eleanor's name. The land was cleared, and in its place rose the modest brick building that would house the Hayes School for Girls. Its purpose was clear from the day of its opening: to educate girls born without fortune, but not without worth. Reading, writing, arithmetic, manners and ethics, the things that Eleanor herself had been given and nearly lost. On the first morning, she stood at the gates in a navy blue dress with white cuffs, her hands ink-stained, and welcomed 11 young girls through the iron doors. She called each by name, looked them in the eye, and told them, "You will not be forgotten." Marcus, for his part, stepped back from the more brutal pursuits of his investments. The railroad contracts he accepted now prioritized labor protections and environmental stability. He declined offers from steel magnates who had once toasted his ruthlessness. Instead, he partnered with a housing initiative in Providence, funding clean homes for widowed veterans and their children. There were evenings when he returned home with his collar loosened and his spirit tired, but Eleanor would meet him on the porch with 2 cups of tea and a quiet nod, and they would sit beneath the lantern and listen to the wind move through the trees. Their home was not the grandest, though Marcus had offered her every luxury. It was the one she chose, a coastal house with high windows and a garden behind it, overgrown with lavender and thyme. And in that garden they walked together often, tracing the same stone paths where they had once passed in silence, back when he was her employer and she was only a girl with ink on her hands and fire in her spine. Now, there were no shadows between them, no questions unspoken, no debts unpaid. One afternoon, while sorting correspondence in the front parlor, Marcus opened a letter marked "Confidential, United States Department of Foreign Affairs." He read it once, then again, and said nothing. But that evening, over supper, he slid the letter across the table to Eleanor. She unfolded it carefully. It was an invitation, a nomination, to Mr. Marcus Vanderbilt for consideration of appointment to the diplomatic post of ambassador to the French Republic. The terms were clear. The title was his, if his household could support the role, if his wife could serve at his side in Parisian society. She read it slowly, her fingers tightening on the edge of the page. When she looked up, Marcus was watching her, not with pressure, not with expectation, but with something closer to fear. "I didn't ask for this," he said, "and I won't go without your consent." She folded the letter. "There was a time I would have seen this as surrender," she whispered, "as stepping into a world I spent years trying to escape. And now?" She stood and crossed to the window, gazing out over the fields where the school's bell had just rung its final note of the day. "Now," she said quietly, "I see it for what it could be. Not a stage, but a platform. Not for them, but for us." She turned back to him, her eyes steady. "But I won't be a symbol, Marcus. I won't be paraded or silenced. If I go with my voice intact." He rose from his chair and came to her, taking her hands in his. "I would never want you otherwise." And in that moment, as the autumn sun dipped low beyond the trees, Eleanor rested her head against his chest and breathed deeply. Not of fear, but of something new. Not hope, not yet joy, but belonging. And in her pocket, beside a fountain pen and a handkerchief, lay her father's watch, restored and ticking softly, not as a relic of what was lost, but as a witness to what had finally been found. Summer arrived softly that year, without the spectacle that usually swept through Newport's social season. There were no orchestras parading down Bellevue Avenue, no sudden eruption of parasols along the boardwalk. Instead, warmth unfolded like a secret in the grass, green and slow and full of promise. The sea no longer whispered of storm and memory, but carried a rhythm that felt tender, almost forgiving. And in the garden behind the coastal house on Ocean Drive, Eleanor sat alone at her writing table beneath the flowering dogwood tree. The morning sun filtered through the petals, casting lace-shaped shadows across the paper before her. Her fingers, ink-stained as ever, hesitated above the page. She had written 6 letters that week, 1 to the Hayes School faculty, 1 to the family of a girl newly admitted, 1 to a friend in Boston, 1 to a widow seeking housing support, 1 to the head of the Providence Reform Committee, and 1 to herself, though she hadn't signed that one. Now she held the 7th, unfinished. It bore the letterhead of the Office of the Secretary of State, her name printed formally beneath Marcus's, beside the title she had not yet accepted, Ambassadress. She traced the word slowly, feeling how it settled in her chest like a stone both heavy and radiant. For weeks, the letter had remained on her desk, untouched. Marcus had not mentioned it again. Not once. He hadn't needed to. Each morning he rose and read beside her. Each afternoon he tended his work and let her tend hers. Each evening they dined without ceremony, and afterward walked among the rows of herbs and hydrangeas, speaking not of politics or society, but of soil, of words, of children who laughed in the classroom windows. He never pressed, because he knew that the only way she would say yes was if no one asked her to. A breeze drifted through the garden, carrying with it the scent of salt and rosemary. From inside the house, she heard her mother humming softly as she folded linens. The world, for a moment, was still. And yet, the question loomed. Could she go back? Back into the parlours with brocade curtains and gilded mirrors, where every glance was a judgment, every smile a blade? Could she stand before ambassadors' wives and senators' daughters and not tremble at the memory of the woman they once called fallen? Could she hold her head high, not as a shadow behind her husband, but as a woman of consequence in her own right? The school had given her peace. The girls gave her purpose. The silence between her and Marcus no longer held ghosts, but still, the thought of stepping again into that world made her heart pause. She stood slowly and walked to the edge of the garden, where the land gave way to the cliff, and beyond it the ocean stretched endless and blue. There, beneath the wide sky, she closed her eyes. She thought of her father, and the way he used to press a hand to her shoulder when reading aloud. She thought of her mother, who had once served tea to women who would later cross the street to avoid her. She thought of Beatrice, and the smile that had never reached her eyes. She thought of herself, the night she walked out of the Ashford mansion alone, her name once again her only possession. And then she thought of Marcus, not the man who had whispered, "You will be mine," but the one who had, without fanfare, given her a desk, a watch, a school, a garden, and the freedom to walk beside him without chains. She opened her eyes. Later that evening, they dined on the terrace. The table was simple, dressed in linen and set for two. The sky was turning gold with dusk, and the breeze tugged at the candle flames without extinguishing them. Eleanor wore a dress the colour of dusk, soft cotton with lace along the sleeves. Her hair was gathered in a loose knot, a pin of pressed violets tucked above her ear. Marcus watched her with quiet reverence, as he always did when he thought she wasn't looking. After they had eaten, he poured her a glass of pear cordial and sat beside her, not across. "I never told you," he said, watching the horizon, "that my mother once dreamed I'd be a senator." Eleanor smiled faintly. "And what did you dream?" "To leave the room without owing anyone a favor." They both laughed, though hers faded quickly. He turned to her, brow furrowed just slightly. "And you? What did you dream?" She looked down at her glass. The flicker of the flame reflected in the amber liquid. "To speak and be believed," she said. "To walk into a room and not feel like an imposter." Marcus reached for her hand. His palm was warm, solid, anchoring. "You do that every day," he said. She looked up at him. "And yet the world always waits for you to forget who you are, so it can remind you who you were." His grip tightened. "Then remind them," he said. "Remind them with every step you take." They sat in silence, the sky dimming, the garden humming with the sound of night's arrival. And then, without ceremony, Eleanor rose, walked into the parlour, and returned with the letter. She placed it before him. "I've written my response," she said. "They may announce the appointment, I will go with you, but on my terms." His eyes flickered with something unreadable. He did not reach for the letter. Instead, he reached for her hand again. "I never wanted to go without you." "You never needed to," she whispered. Later that week, on the first golden morning of June, the couple rose before the staff. The house still drowsed in shadow, and the air was thick with the scent of lilac and dew. Eleanor wore a linen walking dress and a wide-brimmed straw hat tied beneath her chin with navy ribbon. Marcus wore his usual grey, the hem of his coat brushing against the tops of the wet grass. They walked together along the shore, their footsteps leaving soft imprints in the sand. No one called out to them. No carriages passed. The sea was calm. At the edge of the dunes, just before the road curved back toward the town, their driver waited with the carriage, dark green with brass trim, the horses stamping softly in the morning stillness. Eleanor paused, turning to the water one last time. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with salt and morning, and then she smiled. Marcus stepped beside her, brushing her gloved hand with his. "You're ready?" he asked. She didn't answer, not with words. Instead, she looked up at the horizon and said the only thing that still needed saying, "Let the world whisper what it will. I know who I am. The summer of 1902 arrived with a gentler light than those before it, soft, amber, and patient. Newport had changed. The great houses still lined the cliffs like porcelain palaces, but many now sat quieter, their ballrooms gathering more dust than waltzes. The whispers of old society had dulled to memory, and a new kind of voice stirred in the city, one born not of pedigree, but of purpose. And yet, the sea remained unchanged. Still it roared and sighed and kissed the shore like a timeless lover. On the veranda of a modest but elegant white house with wide green shutters, perched on the very cliff where they had once said their vows, Eleanor sat with a letter in her lap and a shawl over her shoulders. Her hair was streaked now with silver, and her hands bore the fine lines of a decade well lived, but her eyes, those storm-grey eyes, remained untouched by time. Behind her, the house was alive with quiet laughter and the muffled thud of hurried feet. A child's voice rang out from an upstairs window, followed by a deep chuckle that belonged unmistakably to Marcus. They had returned to Newport after his diplomatic tenure in France, choosing a quieter life near the school Eleanor had expanded with the help of former students who now taught others to read, to write, to speak with confidence. The Hayes School had become more than a building. It had become a legacy. They had 2 daughters now. Clara, aged 7, curious and willful, with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn mouth. And Lydia, 4, sweet-tempered and quick-witted, already fond of telling her dolls long, dramatic stories before bedtime. Motherhood had not softened Eleanor's convictions, only deepened them. She had spoken at conferences, written essays, refused honours she felt were ornamental, accepted others she knew would open doors for girls like the one she had once been. She had learned that a voice, once found, must be used again and again. Marcus had traded political salons for lectures on ethical business practices. He invested not only in companies, but in communities, factories with proper ventilation, rail lines that didn't displace families. He was mocked by many of his peers and quietly followed by others. They had become symbols, not of scandal, but of transformation. And yet, for all their public legacy, it was the private one that meant the most. In the evenings, they still walked the gardens, now thick with the laughter of small feet and the scent of wild thyme. Sometimes he would read aloud under the same dogwood tree where she had once weighed the future in silence. They had grown older, yes, but not apart. He still looked at her as if she were the answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask until she arrived. And she, in turn, still reached for him in the middle of the night, not out of need, but out of love's quiet habit. As for the past, Ashford Hall had long since been sold. Beatrice, after years of bitterness, had finally married a quiet bookseller in Chicago and faded from the headlines. She sent a Christmas card every year. Eleanor replied only once, simply writing, "I hope you have found peace." "I have." The old matrons of society had grown old indeed. Some had left behind memoirs filled with half-truths and faint regrets. Others had died without ever learning that forgiveness is not something granted by others, but found within. Eleanor folded the letter in her lap and stood. The breeze lifted the hem of her skirt as she stepped down into the garden. From the side of the house came the sound of Marcus's voice, calling for Clara to come down from a tree. Her laughter followed. Eleanor watched, a smile spreading across her face. 10 years ago, she had stood on this very cliff and dared to believe that love could be more than a fantasy, that respect, once broken, could be rebuilt, that a name whispered in scandal could become a name spoken with honor. She had not only survived, she had thrived, and she had done it not because Marcus saved her, but because he had loved her enough to let her save herself. She turned back toward the house as Lydia came running down the path, curls bouncing, cheeks pink with joy. "Mama, Papa said we can go to the shore." "Then we mustn't keep him waiting," Eleanor said, sweeping her daughter into her arms. As they walked toward the sound of waves and laughter, Eleanor glanced once more at the sea. It no longer frightened her. It never had. But now, at last, she knew how to ride its tides and write her own story upon its shores. And the world, well, it could whisper what it liked. She had already answered. In a world that once measured worth by lineage, wealth, and whispers, Eleanor's story reminds us that dignity is not inherited, it is chosen. Her journey from silence to strength, from survival to self-definition, is not just a tale from the Gilded Age. It is a mirror held up to every woman who has ever been underestimated, doubted, or dismissed. This was never only about love, though love, when true, changes everything. It was about reclaiming a voice, about becoming the author of one's fate. Eleanor did not bend to society, she reshaped it. And through it all, she never stopped believing in the quiet power of a kind heart, a clear purpose, and a life lived without fear. If you, like Eleanor, believe that whispers should never define a woman's worth, we invite you to share this story with someone who needs to hear it. A sister, a friend, a daughter. Let her know she is not alone. We would love to know what this story stirred in you. Was there a moment that moved you most? Tell us in the comments below, and if you made it to the end, write the word courage, because that's what Eleanor taught us, that courage is not loud, but it echoes across generations. And before you go, don't miss the other unforgettable love stories we've handpicked for you. They're waiting for you in the cards above. Each one is filled with drama, elegance, and hearts that dared to hope. Thank you for joining us. Until our next journey through time, keep believing in the power of quiet strength.